So this morning, we're beginning a kind of journey towards the events of Christmas morning and all that Jesus' birth means to us. That's the plan over the next few weeks. And what we're doing today is we're doing that by beginning a passage from the Bible which was written hundreds of years before Jesus' birth. It's a piece of the Bible which has inspired great pieces of music, great pieces of art. God's words given to Isaiah have been something which have inspired people for centuries, and they give us incredible promises that someone is going to come, a child who is going to be born, who's going to change absolutely everything. And it uses this kind of metaphor of the child that's being born is going to be like a light in the midst of darkness. Now, when you read this passage, when Jane was reading it, I don't know about you, but you just can't help but feel Christmassy when it's being read, can you? For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. I know for some people there are bits of music playing in your head as you're listening to those words. If you're a Christian, that reading should spark within you a desire and a growing sense of excitement. It should stir your spirit about what God has done and what God will still do in the future. And if you're not a Christian, if you're someone who's investigating who Jesus is, this passage and the breadcrumbs it leaves us to follow through the rest of the Bible should get you to think this, that Jesus, properly understood, is not just a wonderful counselor. He's much more. He's the mighty God. He's the one who changes everything, and he came and walked among us. If he's not God, if he's not the one who does all of the things that this passage says, then all this season is, all this time of year is cheap tinsel, dead trees, and a temporary distraction from the futility of life. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. And so what I want to do this morning is take you a little bit through the wonder of what it means to say that Jesus' birth is like light dawning in a dark place, like light flashing in the darkness, and to show you where it's going to lead us as we go through the entire Bible. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to look at three things. First thing is this. To see the wonder of the light, you've got to see the depths of the darkness. To see the wonder of the light, you've got to see the depths of the darkness. From this passage, the second thing, you have to see what the light does. And the third thing, you've got to know that the light that changes everything is a person who stepped into history to change everything. So first thing, if you're going to grasp what the light is, you have to see the depths of the darkness. Now, this is not something that we are naturally wired to do. We don't like to look at darkness. We don't like pain and discomfort. It's probably why there's some of us in the room who will at times say, when the news is on, I'm not watching that because I don't want to see the darkness. We don't like difficulty. We don't like things that cause us pain. And so we have all kinds of distraction methods to stop us seeing the darkness. They can be things like alcohol and painkillers and work and so on. Anything to not look at the reality that this world is at times an incredibly dark place. And this kind of sense of not wanting to look at things that are bad, it even comes through in some of the songs that we have at this time of year. So we're gonna look at a Christmas song for a moment, the Dean Martin classic, Let It Snow. And I think this song has a really dark side to it that no one ever takes any notice of. So we're going to look at it. What do we know about that song? Well, we know that when they're singing it, they say things like this. The weather outside is frightful, but the fire is so delightful. And since we've nowhere to go, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. Now, it sounds really nice, but what's he just said? He's just said, there's a massive storm outside. It's absolutely chaos out there. It's raging, but we've got a fire, so it's all good. We're not going to look at that dark thing outside because we've got the fire. So there's a hint of darkness in it, but as the song goes on, the darkness gets even bigger, but they don't pay any attention to it. So the next verse says, it doesn't show signs of stopping. Now, for me, that's a real red flag. That's That's something where you should be starting to take notice of this incredible blizzard outside. What does Dean Martin say? He said, well, there's this massive weather bomb dropping outside, but I've got some popcorn. I've got some popcorn. It's all good. I mean, that's short-term thinking, isn't it? If this keeps up, he's going to need something a little bit more substantial than popcorn. Last couple of verses. Where does he go towards the end? When we finally kiss goodnight, oh, I hate going out in the storm, but as long as you hold me tight all the way home, I'll be warm. He needs a coat. That's what he needs. He doesn't need the memory of a cuddle. He needs a coat. That memory will not keep him warm out in this huge storm. He'll freeze. And if you stay in this place, he even goes on to say, the fire is slowly dying. So there's a huge storm. They're in a house where the fire's dying out. All they've got is popcorn. He clearly hasn't got a coat. I mean, I think it's an ominous song. I mean, I think that song should end with, two people are found in a freezing cold house, wrapped up in an embrace, surrounded by empty popcorn packets. That's how that song should end. Now, I'm deliberately being a bit stupid with that. But in that song, the people are so wrapped up in the moment, the danger of the snow is relegated to the background. See, there's a darkness in it, but they're not thinking about it. And you can do it with other songs as well. So Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You. What if you don't get them? What if you never get them? What if you have them and you lose them? What if you have them and you lose them piece by piece? What if life becomes a little bit more dark? What then? See, we don't like to look at the darkness of life. And those are just a few examples. But for the people who lived in the time of Isaiah, they knew what darkness was. When they first received this little bit of the Bible, they really knew what it was to live in darkness. Because in terms of the history of the people who received this bit of the Bible to begin with, because of their rebellion against God, God had done certain things. Nations had started to come in and take them and take their territory. They've turned away from him, they've stopped seeking him, and darkness has descended on their land. So if you were to just look up a few verses into Isaiah chapter 8, we're told things like this. They don't consult God, they have no light in their life. They're hungry and they're roaming the land because there's a famine. They curse God, they curse their king. And then verse 22 says something really interesting. Then they will look to the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they'll be thrust into utter darkness. What that's saying is this: when you take God out of the picture and you just look at this world, and you really, really look at it, it's darkness. It's darkness. They were about to hit a point where they weren't looking to God anymore. They weren't looking up. They were just looking at life. And when they did that, the future is just dark. If there's no God, the future is just meaningless. The future is just pointless. To illustrate this, scientists occasionally write articles like this one. What would happen if the sun suddenly stopped shining? Anyone ever thought of that? What would happen if the sun suddenly stopped shining? Scientists think of that, and they tell us what would happen if the sun stopped shining. So here's some of the things that would happen if there was no sun. Within a week, the global surface temperature would drop to below zero. I would finally let Lorna put the heating on. Within a year, it would be 100 below everywhere on the surface. The majority of life would enjoy a brief post-light existence. Photosynthesis would stop immediately. Most plants would die within weeks. Some trees could survive for a few decades. Animals would die off quickly, with scavengers being the last to go. Even the bulletproof armadillo would eventually succumb to it. And apparently, the only place that humans might survive for some time would be in submarines under the sea, or Iceland, where you could harness some of the volcanic heat that country's got. It's a pretty grim picture when there's no light. When we're in the darkness, it's pretty grim. And that picture maps onto life without God. If you just look to this world for meaning, there is none, because one day the sun does go out, and one day no one remembers you, and one day none of your descendants ever exist. And your choices are to in that moment, try and ignore it. The fire is so delightful, let it snow. Or you have to say, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. Or you have to accept that that's the reality and try and make the best of it. Life might be meaningless, but I will live as if it is not. I will throw starfish back in the sea. I will plant trees. I've brought some corn for popping. Let it snow, let it snow. That's not where the Bible leaves us, though. The Bible doesn't leave us in the dark in a world without God. So if you go back to the reading that Jane read, if you go to verses 1 and 2, the bit we don't tend to read when we read this at Christmas, it says there's a promise. Nevertheless. It starts off by saying there'll be no more gloom for those who were in distress. And it says in that verse, in a really, really unlikely place, because that's what Galilee was, in a really unlikely place, light's going to dawn. Something's going to break in which is going to change the darkness forever. It goes on to say that those living in a land, so verse 2, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Something has happened which changes everything. And that word deep darkness literally means death's shadow. Death's shadow. People living in the shadow of death, a light has dawned. And that leads us on to the second thing. If the world without God is futility and bleak and dark, what does the light do? What does the light do? And this we see in verses 3 to 5. This is what light does. And I want you to try and put on your poetic, imagination-filled heads for a couple of moments to try and see and smell and sense these things. So verses 3 to 5, we're given two pictures of what it's like when light suddenly appears in a dark place. So first of all, it's like a farmer at harvest time. It's like a farmer at harvest time. They've worked hard all year. They've planted. They've looked after their crops. They've watered them. They've put fertilizer on. That's my limit of farming knowledge at this point. They've worked really, really hard. And then at harvest time, they get to look in their barns and they see everything that they've got. And it's saying, when light comes in a dark place, it's like that moment when they're probably full of joy and thinking, wow, what a blessing we've got. What an incredible blessing. Also goes on to say, it's like warriors at the end of a battle sharing out the spoils of war. And that, whilst that might be something which we can't picture very well, maybe think of it like this. It's like the cup final or winning the World Cup. It's suddenly that moment where you've won and you've got all the spoils of victory. It's light coming is like a moment where there's an incredible, incredible victory. It's you've sacrificed hard, and now something has happened. If you've ever had a moment where you've suddenly won, that's kind of what it's saying light coming is like. But it goes on forever. And the images don't stop there. So as it says on the screen, it says, "For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors." Now, when we read things like, "For as in the day of Midian's defeat," we probably say to ourselves, "Oh, that's nice. I have no idea what that means." Is that what we tend to do? Yeah? Well, in a beautiful coincidence, because I don't plan things this well. Do you remember the Nameless series we had a few weeks ago? And there was the time where there was a bunch of guys with a trumpet in one hand and a torch on the other. That's the day of Midian's defeat. And so it's saying that when light flashes and when light comes, it's like that day. So if we think back to that day, what was that about? It was like winning a battle without doing anything. It was like you didn't have to do anything because God has won an incredible battle for you. And all of the oppression of slavery and all of those sort of things have been broken because of what God has done. when this light comes, it's like you've just won a battle and you didn't have to do anything. And it's still not finished in terms of what the light does. It then goes on to say, every boot used in battle, every uniform stained with blood will be burned. War comes to an end. That's what light does. And I want you to kind of hold on to that imagery in your mind for a moment. When light comes, it's like celebrating a bumper harvest. It's like winning the World Cup. It's like being part of a battle that's been won and you did absolutely nothing to win it. That's what it's like when light comes. So people who were living in a futile world without God were being told, hey, something's going to happen where it's like peace and joy gets wrapped up in a bundle and dropped into your life. Then we're told what the light is. And it's a child born in a nowhere place, a child who is God with us. And he's going to do all those things. This child that is born is going to make meaninglessness disappear. And that's where verses 6 and 7 come in, where it talks about a child being born, a son being given, about someone who's going to be a ruler forever, someone who's going to be a wonderful counselor, mighty God, all of those things. It's saying God's going to drop into history and he's going to change everything. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to follow some breadcrumbs and we're going to see where the light that Isaiah talked about appears through the New Testament. So, Graham's already read it, but in John chapter 1, talking about Jesus, it says these words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And then going down to verse 9, talking about Jesus and him coming, it says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world." So if we put these things together, Jesus coming into the darkness to be God's light means that he's coming to bring joy and peace like winning the World Cup. He's coming to win a battle for us that we don't have to fight in. He's coming to bring a peace that lasts forever. Now, how does he do that? How does he do that? Earlier on, I mentioned how scientists have speculated what would happen if the sun was to stop shining and we were plunged into utter darkness. Now, I don't know how it happened. I don't know what mechanisms were at play, but there comes a moment in the life of Jesus where that happens. So in Luke 23, we're told there's a day where it's noon and darkness comes over the whole land because the sun stops shining. And when that happens, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. If you know your Bible well, you know that darkness, as well as being a metaphor for evil, is also a metaphor for God's judgment being expressed. It's a sign of his presence and his justice and his anger at sin. So when the sun stops shining, it's like Jesus was being plunged into the deepest of darkness. He was being plunged into a meaningless world where there's no connection between him and his Father. He does that so we can be set free. That's where he wins the battle that we don't play a part in. That's where he does whatever is necessary to free us from a life of sin and slavery. It's him coming and stooping down to lift up people who could never save themselves. It's like the day of Midian's defeat, where he wins a battle and we do nothing. Darkness swallows him so we can live in the blessings of the light. Now, if that's the lengths God will go to, then Christmas really is the greatest of news. It really is. If you grasp what Jesus does for you, it's like your soul, it's like you get dropped into a perpetual moment of joy of a harvest or winning a battle because light has dawned, because Jesus has come. So this season that we're entering into is about joy coming. It's about forgiveness coming. It's about God going to whatever lengths it was necessary to take you and me people living in darkness and despair and bringing them into his light. Now that's a pretty good thing. That's a pretty good thing. It's better than just let it snow, isn't it? If you trust in Jesus, that's what he's done for you. If you aren't trusting him, your choices are at best to shut off your mind to the futility of life. Or you can look at it and say, one day darkness is going to take me. But for those of you who believe, I want to give you a couple more things to take away. So in John 8, Jesus says these words, "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Now that's not saying if you're a Christian, everything goes perfectly from that moment onwards. It's not saying you never have any hard times. It's saying that even when the darkness comes, you'll have him with you and he'll bring light in your darkness. Even when really tough things come, you'll know where the future is going. So if your life is tough right now, if you're walking through a dark place, he's with you. He's with you and he will bring light to you one day. The Psalm 23, which talks about walking through the darkest of valleys, uses the same word as Isaiah. Where does that story end? In the Psalm, "And I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever." You might walk through a dark place, but one day he'll take you to himself. And that's where we're going to end. So in Revelation 21, we get a snapshot of the end of time. We get a snapshot of the end of history. Anyone else ever find Revelation a quite confusing book? Is it just me who finds it a quite confusing book? Well, in Revelation 21, right at the end, talking about the future when Jesus returns and there's a renewed heaven and a renewed earth, it says, "The city," that is the place where God dwells, "does not need sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it its light and Jesus is its lamp." I'd always found that really, really confusing. But if you chuck in all of the things about what light is, it's saying that then, at that point in the future, it's like the time Isaiah described. Being with Jesus is going to be like a perpetual celebration at the end of a harvest. It's going to be like constantly thinking, we've just won a victory that we didn't play a part in. It's us being reminded constantly, you were once a slave and now you're not anymore. You're with Jesus. Because when he's the light that shines, that's the light that sits on us. So for the Christian, if you're scared about the future, if you're scared about slipping into the darkness of death, what Revelation tells you is this: you're going to end up in the light. You're going to end up in a place of joy and peace and security. You're not going to end up in a world like Dean Martin's song, which was "Let it snow, let it snow, let it snow." You're going to end up in Frank Sinatra's song, "New York, New York." Because if you die, you're going to one day wake up in the city that never sleeps, surrounded by peace, surrounded by joy, all because of Jesus. And over the next few weeks, we're going to delve into this a little bit more. I hope, in what we've thought about today, you feel slightly encouraged, hopefully more than slightly encouraged, because darkness doesn't win. Light wins. Jesus is cut off so we don't have to be. The deep darkness in Isaiah gets us to look at Jesus and to see how he's the king who stoops down to bring us into the light. We're going to pray, and then we're going to sing. Father, we would ask this morning that the amazingness of your Son coming to be with us would speak to us. That the amazingness that you stepped into history in your Son would grip us. That we would be people who would know that if we trust in Jesus, then even though we might not always feel it, we are living in a position where we're safe and we're secure. And that one day we'll be in a place where the light comes from you, which means it'll be like celebrating a harvest. It'll be like celebrating a victory. It'll be like remembering a battle that we had nothing to do with, because Jesus has done everything for us. So help us this year, Lord, to see you a little bit more clearly, to not let the darkness encroach, but to trust in what Jesus has done. And we ask this in his name. Amen.